Wonderful. Hi, folks. I realize I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch. So I will take that responsibility seriously and not run over. And I also, the app thing makes me whatever. So when we say goodbye, you can stay and chat if you like, but we're not going to do the giant everyone waits and doesn't get to get in the lunch line while the Q&A is happening. Because before lunch, that makes me sad. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about Kubernetes here. And every conference talk has to have the traditional second slide is, wait, who am I listening to? Am I in the wrong room? If you don't want to hear about Kubering some netties, you're probably in the wrong room. I won't be offended if you feel the need to find something else. Casey Rosenthal is pretty amazing, for example. But I'm Bridget. I live in Minneapolis. So I actually was able to drive to this conference. Well, my spouse was able to drive. Well, all right, realistically, the Tesla was able to drive with my spouse guiding it to this conference, which was delightful. If I don't look familiar, but I sound familiar, you may have listened to an episode or two of Arrested DevOps, a podcast I occasionally co-host. I am the chief cook and bottle washer for DevOps Days worldwide. I think we're up to about 70 cities. More on that later, because the Chicago one's coming up this summer. And I work at Microsoft. And that is one of those things where you're kind of like, really? And the answer is, yeah, turns out it's a great place to be an open source nerd these days. So every talk needs a little bit of an outline, and chiefly you'll use this as spoilers to determine which stuff you're gonna zone out during. When you're zoning out, I encourage you to tweet if you like about the talk. You can mention me, you can mention the conference hashtag. I believe if you don't like the talk, it's traditional to tweet on the hashtag without mentioning the speaker name, whatever makes you happy. So let's do a little bit of level setting. How many of you folks have done something, anything, tested it out yourself with Kubernetes? I'd say about a good 60% of the room. That's pretty high. That's higher than usual. How many people, and keep in mind I gave this talk on Saturday and on Tuesday last week, so you're an advanced crowd. But how many of you are running Kubernetes in production right now? I see maybe 8 hands, 10 maybe. So like this is kind of that grounding of where we are and how we got to where we are, which is obviously cloud. I could probably just leave it at this, right? Except not really, because when we're talking about cloud, we're talking about abstractions. And sometimes inside your organizations, people are having that discussion about, are we using public cloud? Are we using private cloud? Are we using hybrid cloud? Exactly what does our cloud strategy looks like? And I'm like, I don't know, try not to rain? Like, I woke up this morning and I couldn't see the lake at all. And it was like, oh, okay. That is cloud, but it's not the cloud we're talking about, right? We're talking about the abstractions that prevent you from needing to go to the data center and get your skin really dried out and deal with the rack mounting screws. And if any of you did any of that, you love the idea of spinning up infrastructure without having to hoist anything into a rack. But that doesn't mean that all cloud is going to be exactly the same, have the exact same results for you, depending on what you're trying to do with it. Now, you might be trying to do something with containers. And if you're the sort of person like me who kind of likes to nerd out about kernel features and you're like, cgroups, namespaces, yeah, this is great. This is probably not what your organization pays you to use containers for, right? Like, they care about business value. They care about it being easier to consistently, repeatably deploy things. They care about getting rid of works on my machine. And I think that in the rush to containerize all the things, we may have lost something, because I think a lot of the conversations ignore the fact that just because you lift and shift your kind of janky application into a container does not change anything around your backing data stores. And it doesn't change anything around anything that is not the application itself. It doesn't change anything around how you can scale it. In fact, it might make it more difficult. And so I think that over the last few years, we've had this, let's just containerize it, that'll be great. Just like, let's put it in the cloud, that'll be great. And I work at a public cloud provider, so you absolutely should spend all of your money doing that, except that you probably shouldn't. You should only do that if it solves a problem you actually have. And I think it's easy too there's There are a few people in this room who are as old as me and might have, these are my actual textbooks, mind you. They're sitting on the board, the memory board I took out of a Convex C1 supercomputer before we recycled it in the 90s because I was ancient. But that's a machine I learned to play NetHack on, so there's some bona fides right there. But I bet that some of you have used containers pre-Docker. And so then it's easy to say, well, all of this newfangled whatever, yeah, but we have our application, we have our WAR files, it works fine. Do we need that? And the answer is maybe. Because we've been using containers for a while, containers became a lot more accessible, a lot easier to use for pretty much everyone in 2013 when Docker hit the scene. And I think that if we're doing a history lesson, probably the history lesson that is worth looking at is the fact that we're coming up pretty quick here on the 5-year anniversary of Kubernetes. And if that makes you feel a little bit panicky, like my organization is just starting to explore Kubernetes, and I feel sort of nauseous at the fact that you're telling me we're behind the curve already, and should we just have some serverless instead? I mean, yeah, maybe you should have some serverless, absolutely. But let's talk again about that WAR file. Let's talk about that COTS application. Let's talk about the enterprise realities that a lot of us live, where yes, of course, you love the idea of rewriting everything as functional microservices. That sounds great. The business value that's being produced by the software you wrote 3 years ago or your predecessor wrote 3 years ago, if it's still producing value, it's a pretty hard sell to say we need to rewrite all of that so that it matches the resume-driven development I want to be doing right now. Like, I actually was in a meeting once it was kind of one of those, like, everybody put your ideas out there of what you think we should spike and work on and it'll be exciting. And a young man said that he wanted to write a custom message bus in Erlang. And I was like, okay, that's cool. What problem are we trying to solve? And he said, the problem of me wanting to write a custom message bus in Erlang. And I was like, okay, I mean, at least you're honest about it. I was just doing a rotation on that team. I was not an authorized deal maker in that establishment, and I'm not sure if he ended up getting to write his custom message bus in Erlang. But I feel like a lot of our discussions inside our organizations, that would be the true answer of why we want to do something. And we come up with a different reason to make it palatable but for sprint planning, but that's what we actually want. But if you're looking at the fact that Kubernetes has been around for 5 years, and you're thinking, oh, perhaps I need to Kuber some netties. Maybe I need to get up to speed on this. Maybe our organization should be using it and isn't. I think it's valuable to think about the problems that it solves for your organization. So quick look through some of these functional building blocks of Kubernetes, practically speaking. This is in no way an all of the Kubernetes things. If you made it to Jerome Petazzoni's training, you probably got a good overview. If you didn't, container.training has lots and lots of such information. But I'd say the first thing to realize about Kubernetes is it makes it easy for you to control your infrastructure in a programmable way. You can do it hands-on, interactively, typing kube control, kube cuddle. I do not hold truck with this kubectl thing that Chris Nova started saying. I think she just does it to make us go, what? But yes, there is a joke in the community about the pronunciation of the kube control word. But mostly, you're probably not going to sit there and type kube control against your production clusters and watch things happen. You're probably going to have a pipeline that you're putting these commands into, but the fact that it's API addressable makes it really, programmable as the way that we want infrastructure to be. A pod, if you haven't spent enough time with Kubernetes to know the difference between a pod and a container, the pod holds your collection of one or more containers, and it runs your application. And this is where you're going to start having sidecar discussions, depending on how you feel about sidecars. Saying words is hard. It was very interesting, actually. I podcast too much, so I was about to say there's a link in the show notes. There's not, but I will tweet out a link later to a write-up that the fine folks at Target, a little company you may have heard of out of Minneapolis. It's one of our hometown employers. They had issues with some Kubernetes clusters, and they had a series of cascading failures that they wrote up a bunch of interesting information about. There was Kubernetes and Consul and Kafka in the mix, a lot of that hard K sound. It just wasn't working out well. But they also realized that having sidecars and having small clusters and more of them, and keeping anything that doesn't need to affect other things away from the other things actually helps a lot. So that's kind of, again, like this pod structure, you can start thinking about, how are we going to break this down? Maybe we don't want to have one giant Kubernetes cluster with absolutely all of dev and prod and staging and user acceptance testing, and why not? Like, yeah, if you have all of that stuff in one cluster, you're probably going to have a bad time. When you're setting up your services, there are a number of different kinds of services you can run, but the important thing about those is that they can route traffic to a collection of pods. So those pods are all defined by one specific name. And a deployment, and again, this is like, English has many words. Why do we have to keep semantically overburdening the ones we already use for something else? Well, sorry, I didn't make that decision. But a deployment is the process of using a replica set to replicate the container multiple times. And what this is ignoring is if you're sitting there and you're saying, well, actually, what about stateful sets? And yes, what about all of the other kinds of things you can launch that aren't deployments? Yes, absolutely, those all exist. You can do them in the workshop, in the container.training workshop if you want. But the one thing you should pay attention to when you're first getting started is deployments. Okay, we'll pause for a brief mention of my employer. No, not really. What's important here is all of your cloud providers out there, and I work for one, but they all have services like this. Amazon has EKS, Google has GKE. I think the fine folks at Oracle and other, the IBM folks, other clouds, all have a managed Kubernetes service. And if you take one thing away from this talk, it should be that while you absolutely can run through Kelsey Hightower's excellent Kubernetes the hard way and stand up Kubernetes because you're all smart people and you can do that, that will take a non-zero amount of your time, and it will be really difficult for you to go on vacation to the lake and, or up north or wherever, going to, Door County in Wisconsin or whatever. You're going to have a hard time if you set it all up yourself versus using a managed service. So think very carefully about whether or not your needs can be met by a service from your cloud provider of choice, just because even though you understand Kubernetes and running the clusters, I've talked to so many people out there, customers and not customers, who stand up some clusters and then find themselves a little bit trapped because they have to keep upgrading them, and you're on that upgrade, habit trail. So that is worth thinking about. Most of your managed services out there, this is a picture of how Azure does it, but all of the providers do something like this. They generally manage the control plane for you and deal with the upgrades and whatnot of that. And then you'll have complete control of your nodes with your kubelet and everything else. And at this point, if you're kind of like, kubelet, wait, what about virtual kubelet? Yes, we'll talk about that. If you want to take your chocolate and peanut butter of serverless and Kubernetes and put them together, yes, the virtual kubelet, virtual node stuff is the way we'll go there. But whatever process you've been using to launch clusters, if you look at the managed services, and again, these examples are from Azure because I have all the free Microsoft credits that I can use, but these could very easily be examples from any other cloud provider. They all basically do this sort of thing, which is there's a command to instantiate your cluster. You can see the nodes, they're real, they're running. And then this is a little bit of an eye chart, but I do post the slides. Actually, the slides are already up on my SlideShare, and I'll post on the web later. But you want to have something that you want to have when you're running Kubernetes for realsies, like in production, is you want to have the ability to upgrade pretty easily. Because I don't know if you noticed this, but there are CVEs everywhere all the time that apparently are designed to make us terrified or sad. And there also are, by the way, breaking changes and point releases all the time, which is why your cloud providers are going to tend to lag by a release or two. And so you can see that what got installed when I made this slide last week, I don't even know if the numbers have changed by now, but the version that gets installed by default, 1.11.9, is not the highest version number available, The 1.12 releases are available in AKS. And if you went right to head, like 1.14 is available. It has delightful CVEs, like everything else in the world. Sorry, not sorry, computers. So sidebar, by the way, sidebar to the sidebar to the sidebar. My dad is a physician, and I remember thinking when I was a kid, getting paged in the middle of the night and having to solve problems, that seems terrible. I probably am not going to go into that. And then I went into computers, and I spent 15 years on call for production, and so that didn't work out as planned. I'm not on call for production anymore, by the way. Now I just have 6:30 a.m. flights tomorrow out of O'Hare, which everything in that sentence is terrible, especially the O'Hare. Sorry, not sorry, but anyway, so like if you want to be able to upgrade a running cluster, then if your provider of choice probably has a command that will upgrade that cluster. That will upgrade your control plane, it will upgrade your nodes, et cetera, but it will do that in a zero downtime sort of way. So that's a sort of thing, again, like we are starting to talk about operability, and like sure, of course, absolutely, you can stand up a Kubernetes cluster that isn't Minikube and actually works, but like maintaining it over time, you need to think about what tools are we going to use to make sure we can do these upgrades seamlessly. Because I'm pretty sure once everyone in your organization is enjoying Kubernetes, they're not going to want you to take a maintenance window to like upgrade it. Like, no, Kubernetes has that built in, and you're like, ugh. Okay, you also are going to have the ability to either just with a CLI tool or in response to usage, scale your clusters up and down. Okay, but let's talk about some of the other tools that aren't Kubernetes itself. Kubernetes itself tries, they don't always succeed, but they try to keep a fairly tight, narrow scope. I think a good example of where they have succeeded is the overlay network. Like usually when Jerome and I run workshops, we use Weave because it's easy to install, but there's like 17 or 18 other overlay networks you could choose. And the Kubernetes project is not like, we're gonna pick a winner. Like, no, just use whichever one has the feature set and maybe compatibility with whatever other things you're using. But that means if you're thinking like, oh, so Kubernetes isn't just one thing. Oh, heavens no, absolutely not. It's zillions of tiny important decisions that it's really easy to get wrong, yay. Okay, so we'll talk, these are the tools we're gonna go over here. That does not mean that these are the only tools in the world. It does mean that I have actually used them all and think that they are okay, so. Starting with Terraform. So even though Terraform, and you're like, wait a minute, your t-shirt says Microsoft, It's like, okay, HashiCorp is wonderful, the people are great, and their tools are fantastic. And crucially, if you are the kind of organization that is starting to think about a multi-cloud future, you're quickly realizing that your ARM templates or your cloud formation is sort of a problem. Because you're like, crap, we spent all this time getting ready to spin up infrastructure and getting it all consistent. And if we want to go multi-cloud, that doesn't work super well in that we have to translate it all into this other kind of templating. And so like Terraform obviously helps with that. It helps with your infrastructure stuff because you could just use it to spin up the cloud infrastructure of choice. It also helps with the Kubernetes stuff because Terraform has a lot of built-ins for Kubernetes such that you can spin up your infrastructure, spin up Kubernetes on your infrastructure, and then interact with Kubernetes on your infrastructure, all with Terraform. So if you haven't looked at the providers and modules available for Kubernetes in the terraform.io website, that might be an interesting and fun surprise. Like it's worth looking at that, especially if, and this is kind of one of those like strategy things, if you've been using Terraform inside your organization already, and you really want to start using Kubernetes, but people are a little resistant to a whole bunch of new tooling, and there's probably YAML and sadness, like you could at least talk to them about HCL instead. So, okay, but if you're not terrified of YAML and whatever, Helm is a good thing to look at for your applications that you're going to run on Kubernetes. Specifically, if you want a way to package them so that they are easier to use on Kubernetes. So you can use Helm, and it's a package manager, kind of like an apt or a yum, but specifically for applications to run on Kubernetes. You can use it on your applications. You can also use Helm packaged applications that other people are providing to the public. So let's look at the details of this really quick. Helm charts, and by the way, if you're sitting here going, yeah, you're talking about Helm, but isn't Helm 3 a thing? We'll talk about that for sure. But most of this is all going to still apply between Helm 2 and Helm 3. But the charts are a really good way to make sure that your application is going to be installed the same every time. Because of course, when you install things, they're always installed in the consistent way with all of the correct, bash scripts that you have that definitely check exit status, and error codes. But if you're going to have applications that you want to install on your multitude of Kubernetes clusters for your testing and development environments and what have you, or the ad hoc stuff that people are spinning up, it's nice to have a really consistent way to, package a specific and install a specific application. It obviously makes updating a lot easier. So with in-place upgrades, of course. The sharing part I think is really interesting because this is like you can just go Helm install like Prometheus, because somebody told you definitely want to try out Prometheus. And if you go to the website and start reading readmes and facts and quick starts, spoiler alert, are not actually quick. If they need to write you a giant document, it's probably not quick. But if you have a command that can just install things, yeah, that's quick. Oh yeah, and I should mention the public or private servers, so that if you have your special secret application you use internally, you can host your Helm charts internally. I'm not this artistic, so this particular thing is right off the Helm website, but I actually have vigorous disagreements with this term, because I think that share can't turn back time, and neither can you. If you can, please talk to me about your time travel startup, because that sounds like something I want to invest in. But really, what you can do is you can roll forward to the new version that is hopefully like the version from before you were very sad and being paged. So that's what you actually want, because rollbacks are a damn dirty lie. Okay, so that's a quick overview of Helm. There's a lot of stuff that Helm can do for you, but there's other things too. Like draft, for example. So if you're doing local application development, you don't necessarily want to have to learn how to write Helm charts. The YAML, so much YAML, content warning for YAML. But like if you're just trying to do quick iterative inner loop of development, being able to use draft, it'll detect it. It has kind of Heroku style build packs, and it can detect the language your app is written in and generate a Docker file and a Helm chart for you, which you can then make changes to if you need to. But that makes it a lot easier to get started with trying this stuff without spending a great deal of time on the scaffolding when what you want to work on is your application. Brigade is for those of us who are really tired of YAML. No, Brigade is for Kubernetes is by intent, by design, a declarative system, which is to say that you're defining desired state and you're converging via controllers on that desired state, which is great if you can define a fixed desired state that you want to get to and stay at. But as we all know, sometimes your application in the course of working will have events that you want to trigger something else. It's like you don't want to converge to this particular defined state until this thing happens. And so you can write some JavaScript to actually take actions if certain things happen either in your cluster state, in your external storage, in your application itself. And then you can run absolutely anything that you want to run just based on activities that have happened in your cluster. Okay, if you're looking at that skeptically and thinking, the happy path sounds great, but what happens when Brigade does something unexpected? Yeah, of course, absolutely, we want dashboards for that. So Cached, you can use either a GUI or it has a CLI that you can also install. And that lets you see what your Brigade jobs are doing, and probably you'll look at it if your Brigade jobs fail. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you could just sit there and look at the blinking lights and be happy that things succeeded. But mostly, you're going to look at that if something goes wrong. And these are all, by the way, all these tools that I'm mentioning are small, lightweight, open source, independent tools that have multiple contributors. I think Helm and Brigade are both CNCF projects now. So there's a lot of community involvement that, and again, these are not the only projects in the Kubernetes community space, far from it, there are many. But these are ones that I'm involved enough with to tell you that I can see that they work well for some people's needs. But those are a series of tools that came before we actually started talking about a spec. So this was announced at DockerCon last fall, and it was like Microsoft, Docker, Bitnami, I think HashiCorp is in the mix somewhere. A number of organizations realized that a lot of what we started doing with all like the packaging for applications was good, but it didn't necessarily go far enough. And some of it was too Kubernetes specific. Because if you want to have all the complexity of your application, including its backing services, including whatever kind of defined state it needs in your infrastructure, including anything that maybe has nothing to do with Kubernetes, but you need this set this way for this particular application to work in this environment, it became obvious that it would be nice if there were a industry standard spec so that it was a lot easier for people to, instead of having what we have these days, the wiki pages and checklists, and maybe you have a Helm chart somewhere, and you definitely have a Docker file, and heaven help us if you end up with the wrong version of one or the other. So one of the most valuable things in there is the versioning, but we'll talk about that. Duffle is an open source project that's a CNAB implementation specifically for the bundle interactions. So if it's very lightweight, it's very small. It's a good point of entry if you want to try something in the CNAB space. Try Duffle. All of these, by the way, are available. I have links at the end, but all of these things have websites and are available. Porter is worth looking at if you get serious about trying to use CNAB, because it actually does an implementation of a great deal of the things that CNAB is capable of, which is to say the versioning of bundles such that you can make sure that you're installing all of the dependencies at the tested and correct version that work for this specific application. And then you can also sign the bundles, and that's in the spec and it's implemented in Porter. You can sign them such that, say you want to use them in an air-gapped environment, or say you want to make sure that developers are only using the signed version of things. If you're charged with security or with infrastructure and you want to make sure people are using only the blessed thing, and not just the blessed one specific thing you can check a version number on, but also the blessed all the stuff that went with it to install it correctly. So that and the possibility of using mix-ins means it's a lot easier to build bundles. If you want to build bundles that are pretty much just like that application over there, but a little different. Okay, so Porter's worth looking at for that. I did mention Helm 3 before, and I will tell you the helm.sh/blog has started. I think they're on the 3rd or 4th post now of the road to KubeCon. KubeCon is in Barcelona in mid-May, so there's a bunch of stuff, announcements and things coming out at that point. But there's a bunch of blog posts coming out about Helm now that are talking about what's in Helm 3. So the Go Lua stuff is going to be very beta, but the tiller deprecation is pretty big. So if any of you have used Helm before, you might be like, you're removing tiller. What is the server-side stuff going to be? I have many questions, or maybe I'm very happy, or whatever, depending on what your opinion is of the experience you've had with tiller. And so that actually is due to changes in Kubernetes itself. Some of the work that Tiller was doing with the versioning and server-side configuration stuff is much better handled in Kubernetes itself. I think after 1.7 or 1.8, it kind of became obvious that some of the stuff that had been needed until, via Tiller, provided via Tiller and had been needed early on, no longer needed. So, and there's a number, ooh, we have exciting, all right. There's a number of changes around chart repository and other things. You can go read the blog posts about it, or check out the Helm 3 branch, the Helm 3 dev branch on GitHub. This is obviously an open source project, so you can participate there. One other thing that doesn't fit neatly into what we were talking about before, but it is interesting for people who are starting to think about where do I want to do functions as a service type stuff versus just running nodes that sit there all the time and maybe sometime there's a job. I don't know about you, but I think every place I've ever worked has had a budget and someone who cared about money. And as it turns out, running a whole bunch of infrastructure that is sitting idle doesn't make anyone happy. So even your cloud providers would love to have you spin things down if you're not using them, because hey, that's great. So the virtual kubelet project was spiked by, I think it was Jesse Frizzell, Eric St. Martin, and a few other people before KubeCon US last year. And this is, the idea is that the kubelet basically controls your nodes that you're adding, but do you need to have a node that is like existing that's sitting there? Or could you have something that acts like a kubelet and just spins up something, or attaches to perhaps, I don't know, all of the vSphere and sadness that you have the long lease for, or whatever. Like making more use of infrastructure that you otherwise wouldn't have. This, by the way, I'll blow it up so you can read it, was in December. Brendan Burns was tweeting about, we actually are productizing the Virtual Kubelet project. We donated Virtual Kubelet to the CNCF because Virtual Node is now in preview. And the idea there is just very much like serverless on your Kubernetes, which is you don't want to necessarily be running these nodes unless they have workloads. So, but obviously you need technology that controls when to spin them up so that your workloads don't have to idle, right? So that's worth looking at. And then the last tool I want to focus on here is, well, spec, I guess, is Open Policy Agent. So some of you might have used tools like InSpec or something like that before. And I think most enterprises that are starting to use Kubernetes, well, first they spend a lot of time with RBAC controls and like figuring out what and where to lock down. But then they also start wondering, how can we make sure that no one is going to run a job that isn't tagged with their username or the team that they're on? Like, especially if you're, I mean, hopefully you don't have absolutely massive enterprise-wide shared clusters, but there are going to be groups that are big enough that you're not necessarily going to just like say in the team chat, you know, hey, who's running this? It doesn't respect any limitations and is taking the cluster down. So like the idea of even just as simple as, let's make sure any job that starts is going to have the resource limit set this way. And let's make sure that any job that starts is going to have this contact information for the people who are running it. Or let's make sure that any job that starts has other characteristics that you can define. It's really, it's very wide open as to what you can define. Anything you can test and measure, you can define to say this is what you are allowed to run, this is what you're not allowed to run. And this is, again, an open source project. And I like the fact that there's flexibility there because not everyone wants to make everyone use a specific library. Sometimes you might be like, people are just going to run what they're going to run, and we're just going to run a sidecar that just observes it. Maybe you want to run this as a daemon on the host themselves and not interfere with the operation of the cluster. There's a lot of choices, and I've just started digging into this, but if this sounds relevant to your Kubernetes-related needs, free, open source, worth taking a look at. All right, so I feel like you have a general responsibility anytime somebody gives you a mic and points a camera at you to prognosticate about the future, right? All right, so let's think about this. I actually think what's happening right now is another sea change, very similar to when virtualization swept over the land, which is to say, if you're thinking that you can probably hold off on paying attention to Kubernetes, and you probably aren't thinking that. So if there are people in your organization who are telling you that your interest in and desire to use Kubernetes is premature, you probably should tell them that their bank and their airline and their government are all using it. So like they are not the bleeding edge at this point. They're not even like the fast followers. Like this is a very active space with, again, I mentioned the breaking changes in CVEs, so there is a lot to pay attention to and to focus on there in terms of making sure it's right for your needs. But it's probably worth at least having the discussion of whether or not you should be using Kubernetes. That does not, by the way, mean that Kubernetes, which is to say a complex container orchestrator, is right for every specific workload out there. I mean, there are definitely people who are just doing quick spin-up test implementations of things that find Docker Swarm works fine for their needs. There are people who have workloads that is quite suited to something like Mesos and Marathon. Cindy Sridharan, Copy Construct on Twitter, wrote a really good blog post last year, I think it was, about how their organization investigated Kubernetes for a specific use case and went with Nomad. Because what I will tell you about Kubernetes is it has a lot of inherent complexity. So yes, you have to care. Yes, you have to be looking at this. But yes, you also want to make the responsible choice for the specific use case you're looking at as to whether or not the incidental complexity that it brings is worth it, is a good trade-off for the benefits that it gives your specific set of workloads. And that's like, again, like I work at a cloud provider. We'd love to have people do things, but I still tell people don't do things unless it's right for your needs, because you want happy customers, right? You don't want unhappy customers who feel like they bought a whole bunch of complexity that they didn't need and now they're sad. So look at that very carefully, but you got to look at it. I will say that it's easy to talk in a lot of metaphors about computing. It's like, yes, the cloud is still computers. Yes, we shouldn't have our humans in silos. This is actually not photoshopped. I took this picture, by our community garden. Yes, if you have a whole bunch of shipping containers or Docker containers, that's not going to make you DevOps, whatever that word means. If anyone knows, please let me know. But I will say that if you want to have those kind of discussions, it's probably really valuable for you to talk to other people in your local community who are trying to have those discussions. If for no other reason, then they might be able to tell you about the giant project that they spent, 12 months on that turned out to not solve the particular problem that they were trying to solve. And you'll be like, that sounds exactly what my VP thinks we should do next month. And so it's valuable, I think, to, of course, go to sessions. I run DevOps Days Minneapolis. That's coming up at the beginning of August. Your DevOps Days Chicago CFP is open right now. And if you're thinking to yourself, I'm not sure what that is, and I'm pretty sure I don't care, you might actually care, because it's a call for participation. And until the end of this week, you could go to devopsdays.org, click on Chicago, and tell them about the story that you can tell. And if you think to yourself, oh, but I'm not fancy, if the early user case studies of we tried this, and this, only one of them, only number 3 wasn't a disaster, and 1, 2, 4, and 5 caused us these problems, and here's why, those stories are gold. Like, conference organizers love them. Your immediate peer group who attends loves hearing about what your experience was, just so that they can try to apply it to the problems they're trying to solve. And it's also excellent for your career progression as well. Like, again, if you think of it on a range from the resume-driven development that ends up causing more problems than it's worth, and those colleagues kind of hate you after you leave to go to the fun startup, and you leave them with the huge amounts of technical debt, okay, ranging all the way to the responsible rollout that you cared about documentation and you talked to people about their use cases, and then you shared with the community, thereby making it so much easier for your organization to hire. I mean, you can kind of see there's a broad spectrum there, but there's a lot of good you can do while still having a lot of fun with shiny new things. All right, so I will quote Eric St. Martin here, and if you don't know him, he's one of my colleagues who's one of the co-founders of GOTOcon. And I like how he riffs on Halt and Catch Fire here. He says that, okay, it's not like we're gonna all say to ourselves, hey, we've converted everything to Kubernetes, and now I guess tech is just done, dust off our hands, go home. Obviously it's not realistic to think that there's one specific technology that when we get done with that migration, we'll be done forever. That's ridiculous. But this is a sea change that takes us to the next set of problems that we're going to be able to solve. And so that's why it matters, because you may or may not end up using it for absolutely everything ever, but the mentality shift here, the way that it interacts with both the infrastructure and the workloads is built on all of that stuff that came before, but does bring us something new. So that's why, because it's going to get us to the next change. And if you work at a change-resistant organization, it might be instructive, it might be valuable for you to go to them and say, yeah, you know how you didn't want to change this thing? Did you know that Jeffrey Snover, who created PowerShell and has worked at Microsoft since the 90s, was tweeting about how Azure is more than 50% Windows. Sorry, not Windows. Azure is, instead of being, as one would expect, mostly Windows, is over 50% Linux VMs. And again, like maybe you're not an Azure customer, so you don't care about that specifically. That's not important. The point is that you can make the point that this is not a change you would have seen coming. So anyone who says, oh, we don't do things that way here, and you're trying to get them to do something, you can make the point that 20 years ago, we had the Halloween documents. If you don't know what it is, go read Wikipedia, kids. But it was basically Microsoft hates Linux, film at 11. That was 20 years ago. Literally Halloween this year, I was standing in London running a Kubernetes on Azure, all on Linux instances workshop. And I was like, this is a really weird flex, because 2018, 2019 is a very weird time, I gotta tell you. It's possible we live in the darkest timeline, but it also is possible that we're in a time where your big cloud providers have realized that the customers are trying to get their stuff done. They don't care about your internal politics. They don't care about whatever you want them, whatever the cloud provider wants you to use. The only thing that matters is you being able to get the stuff you want to get done. And if you can get your organizations to realize that the world has changed. The world has changed enough that Microsoft donated all its patents. Again, this is like a company that was not well known for being friendly to open source, donated all its patents to the Open Invention Network. That's Nat Friedman, who's running GitHub now. I feel like this is not just about the company I work at. This is about the changes you can make inside your organization, because you can make these arguments. And it's like, all right, there's actual evidence that seriously enterprise-y companies are doing these things, and you can too. So plus, we not only donated a whole bunch of patents, we also donated the absolutely adorable illustrated Children's Guide to Kubernetes, like Phippy and Friends. Donated those to the CNCF too. This is them adventuring in Seattle. So it's adorable, it's fun. There's a lot of stuff in this space. Most of those tools that I pointed to earlier are on deuslabs.io. A lot of my colleagues are on a free tour that is doing a whole bunch of these demos, and you can see that at the Ignite tour. It's worldwide, so. If you want to look at Microsoft-specific hosted Kubernetes, or just look at the docs, I think our docs are really good, so go read that and then use whatever you want to use. And then there's also the free learning platform that, again, has a whole bunch of free stuff on it that you can try out. And maybe it'll have a learn module from me if I write one eventually. It's like in my copious free time. So yeah, that's what I've got. I'm running a couple of minutes early, which gives you the opportunity to get in the lunch line or come up and chat with me or talk to your colleagues about all the stuff that you're going to do next. It's hopefully going to be awesome. So thank you.